I'd like to talk with you a little about prayer. It's a matter of anxiety, perhaps, and a struggle for many who feel that their prayer is inadequate and unworthy. My only claim to be an expert in prayer is that I have experienced those very concerns myself for so many years. And if I have any expertise to share with you, it is the product of that concern. And I think and hope that I have some good news for you about it. Let me begin by noting that although we categorize and systematize prayer in various ways, we talk about vocal prayer, mental prayer, contemplation, adoration, intercession, confession, and so on. Prayer is in truth the totality of our relationship with God. The prophet Micah said this, "What does the Lord require of you but to do justice and love kindness and to walk humbly with your God?" I'd like to suggest to you that our life of prayer ultimately is the carrying out of that last phrase, walking humbly with our God. An elderly couple who have been married for very many years may spend an evening together by the fireside. Maybe she's knitting, maybe he's reading, saying very little in words as the hours pass. But they are in a deep state of relationship, fellowship, communion with each other. Nonetheless, they are simply but profoundly present to each other. Perhaps earlier in the evening she had cooked supper, he had laid the table, each of them giving full attention and care to their respective tasks. But that doesn't mean that they left each other's company, as it were. So, as someone once said, if you're driving down Central Expressway at rush hour, you should be giving that your full attention, and not pondering at that point the mystery of the triune God. By so doing, by driving carefully and considerately, arriving safely, you're doing exactly what Micah proposed. Indeed, there should be no conscious passing from prayer, or really to prayer, if the prayer life is wholly healthy, nor need I be immediately conscious of God or my resolution. If our prayer life were perfectly healthy, there would be no passing from prayer to prayer. The whole life would be prayer. If we give our lives to God, everything in our lives become prayer. If we don't give ourselves to God, even our prayer may be turned into sin. Prayer really means two things, both actions of the will, getting oneself and giving oneself, but you cannot give what you've not got. Our life is itself to be our prayer. Our prayer is our effort to bring all things in our life under the direction and rule of the Holy Spirit. But our life is really our prayer. We can only give back to God the kind of day His providence first gives us. But the giving to Him of that kind of day is our prayer. If God gives you a day of toil, you can only give Him a day of toil. And that day of toil is your prayer. Your prayer is the love you put into it. If God gives you a day of conflict, you can only give Him a day of conflict. And that day of conflict is your prayer. And what you call your prayer is again the love you put into it, to bring it under the direction and the rule of the Holy Spirit. If God gives you a day of joy, then you can give Him your gratitude in the enjoyment of it, and that is your prayer. George Herbert was a great English poet who lived from 1593 to 1633, and he wrote this, "Teach me, my God and King, in all things Thee to see, and what I do in anything, to do it as for Thee." Someone who came to understand this profoundly was Brother Lawrence, who was born Nicholas Herman in France in 1611. He was converted to Christ at the age of 18 in an interesting way. He saw a barren tree in the wintertime, waiting silently and patiently for the coming of spring, when leaves and buds and fruit would fill it with abundance. Gazing at the tree, he grasped the goodness and extravagance of God's grace. He felt like the tree, barren, but he sensed God had a life of fullness waiting for him. He was seized with a deep love and gratitude for God and a deep respect of God's power and providence. The awareness of God came to Brother Lawrence that day, and he placed his faith, his trust, his life in the hands of Jesus. It would, however, be 6 years from that day before he joined a religious order to live in a monastery. In the intervening years, he first served in the military because that was a way to get 3 square meals and a small stipend. And then when he got out of the military, he was a footman, one of those men who rode on the back of carriages in those days to open the door and help the occupants down to the ground. But he was extremely clumsy and an awkward man, and so he was not long for that job. And then at the age of 25, he applied to work in a monastery. Uneducated and so unable to become a choir monk, they put him to work in the kitchen, peeling potatoes and washing dishes. Remember, that was long before the days of gas or electric cooking, before running hot water, detergent, stainless steel. So kitchens were hot, smoky, busy places. And there he stayed for the next 55 years, working in the kitchen, except for the last few years when he was too old to stand for long periods of time. And so he got a sit-down job repairing the monks' sandals. How is it that an uneducated kitchen worker could become a hero of the faith? That's the most fascinating part. Because of his busy job in the kitchen, he was not often released by his superiors to go to the set times of community prayer and worship. And so Brother Lawrence decided to make the kitchen his sanctuary. There he developed a way of life that he called practicing the presence of God. Before too long, he had such a radiant peace and a constant joy that the monks began going to him in the kitchen for counsel and help. The highest officials of the monastery would often go down to the kitchen to receive encouragement and guidance. Visiting dignitaries to the monastery would ask if they could talk for a while to Brother Lawrence. The most famous quote from Brother Lawrence is probably this one. He said, "The time of business does not differ with me from the time of prayer. And in the noise and clatter of my kitchen, while several persons are at the same time calling for different things, I possess God in as great a tranquility as if I were upon my knees at the Blessed Sacrament." He believed, as all Orthodox Christians do, in the omnipresence of God, meaning God's presence everywhere. In very ancient times, people tended to believe in different gods for different places. A god of the Egyptians in Egypt, a god of the Assyrians in Assyria, a god of the Babylonians. But the Hebrew people asserted there was one God of heaven and earth, and that God, our God, is everywhere. And nowhere is that better expressed than in Psalm 139. Where can I go then from your presence? Or where can I flee from your spirit? If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there. If I take the wings of the morning and settle at the farthest limits of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me fast. There's nowhere we can go to escape God, to get away from him. He is present in nightclubs, bars, in prisons, in boardrooms, the stock exchange, in courtrooms. He's present in houses, in our homes, in our family rooms, kitchens, everywhere. And this belief in the omnipresence of God led Brother Lawrence to the conclusion that God was present in his kitchen. And so he kept an ongoing conversation with God about what he was doing, about God's presence, God's goodness. When he realized that he'd gone a while without thinking of God, he would just say he was sorry, not dwell on it, and go back to thinking about and talking to his Lord. Hear this encouragement in Brother Lawrence's words. God does not ask much of us, says Brother Lawrence, merely a thought of him from time to time, a little act of adoration, sometimes to ask for his grace, sometimes to offer him your sufferings, at other times to thank him for the graces past and present he has bestowed on you in the midst of your troubles, to take solace in him as often as you can. Lift up your heart to him during your meals and in company. The least little remembrance will always be the most pleasing to him. One need not cry out very loudly. He is nearer to us than we think.